One thing that's left to do for today is I want to give you guys my first impression of the new format post newest TCG ban list. Of course, that's what everyone is excited for at the moment. The new format, what should you play? Everyone has their opinions, and I want to get mine out there too. I will say I am going to include some archetypes from Doom of Dimensions, because I felt like it was going to be weird to make a tier list now and then Doom of Dimension releases in like 1.5 weeks and then I basically have to start over. So I'm going to give you guys my first impression of some of the Doom of Dimensions archetypes. I have a pretty good understanding of what the existing decks receive in Doom of Dimension, like for example Yummy and Draco Tail and K9. Like I'm pretty familiar with those new cards as well, but like some of the newer archetypes, I'm just giving you a first impression, and take that one with a grain of salt, please, because I've also not played a whole lot with Doom of Dimensions yet, but I will soon in anticipation of YCS still. But I have looked at all of the cards and I have a first idea. Now, of course, the balance was relatively large, so some of these decks will receive a lot. Like a lot of things will change from the current format, where basically at the moment we're coming out of the format where Vanquish Soul K9 and Yummy are arguably the two best decks, and everything else is like trailing behind a little bit, but a lot of other stuff was also viable. So why don't we go ahead and talk about those two old best decks first? So Vanquish Soul, first things first. I think Vanquish Soul is taking a significant hit from this ban list consistency-wise. I played this deck at 2 regionals, and I think consistency was already the biggest problem, because for Vanquish Soul in particular, it was not really enough to just see the K9 cards. Like piecing together some sort of K9 combo half board was never really enough to win the games. You really needed access to your Vanquish Soul cards, and losing 2 copies of Raisin and 2 copies of Stake Your Soul is really, really harsh. The pure Vanquish Soul deck basically cannot recover from that at all. I think K9 Vanquish Soul, as soon as Doom of Dimension comes out, can recover from it a little bit because of the new K9 monster, which I would assume if you're going to play K9 Vanquish Soul, you're probably going to play multiple copies of it now, because it gives you a pseudo starter, right? K9 Noroi is a normal summon that specials another K9 from the deck, and it can lead to a Saryuja Skull Dread, which is like a pseudo consistency piece for the deck. Ultimately, though, I think K9 Vanquish Soul suffers a lot. I think it's going to be more like a tier 3 deck. I think simply there's going to be other decks that are better at what it does. I think in the beginning of the format, it could still be performing okay, but I think like the attributes are kind of messed up with only 1 Raisin. Good fires are very hard to find. You will have to play the Rescue Ace cards now. The consistency for going first, I think, is very hard to replace. You're going to have to play some very suboptimal cards, especially going second. Like drawing cards like 7th Tachyon or Small World in masses is just not going to be it. I think it's not a terrible deck, but I wouldn't advise anyone to play Vanquish Soul right now, unfortunately. Yummy, I think, is still a tier 1 deck. I don't think it is going to be the best deck of the format. I will discuss some of the decks that I think are also going to be very good, and some of them have a pretty good matchup against Yummy, which is why I think Yummy has tough contention up there even after Doom of Dimension. Yummy gets another main deck monster in Doom of Dimension that is also an extender. It can special summon itself from hand if you control no monsters. That's pretty good for Yummy, and it will replace the consistency that is lost from Obedience Schooled. However, I think Yummy is not going to be the best deck, because there's going to be some other decks that I'll be discussing in a second that have a pretty good time against Yummy, and I think are also benefiting from this ban list a lot. So keep that in mind. I think Yummy is going to be a strong deck, but it's going to have very strong competition. But it's definitely not dead. You know, 1 Obedience Schooled, you can make up for it. You can play more consistency cards. Piri Rise Map, Sky Striker. I would highly recommend trying Triple Tactics Thrust. I played that at my regional with Yummy yesterday. Even that was old ban list, but still thrusting for Obedience Schooled felt very powerful, and that's obviously going to be even more important when Obedience Schooled is now at 1, because that's one of your best cards at going second. So I think Thrust is going to be a mainstay in Yummy decks in the upcoming format. Crystron. I think Crystron K9 is still a good deck. I think that deck suffers less than Vanquish Soul Crystron, simply because you're not losing as many consistency pieces, and that deck usually leans a little bit higher on the K9 cards. Compared to Vanquish Soul, the K9 cards actually are good starters for the Crystron package. You know, you can go for Infinitrack River Stormer, and that's going to search you Scrap Recycler, and that's going to bridge into your Crystron cards. The only problem with K9 Crystron, it's a very hit or miss deck. It either has, like, if you open like Jockle Sulfador, very hard to stop it. But at the same time, if you don't open those 2-card combos, then sometimes it struggles and it has less 1-card combos than before. And it also doesn't really synergize super well with the new K9, I think, because the new K9 uses your normal summon, so you can't really bridge into Christian anymore, right? Because you need your normal summon for the scrap recycler, I think. If you go for the normal summon, then you would have to do some weird things, but maybe there's lines for it. Maybe there's lines where you can River Stormer and then still make like yugioh to summon the scrap recycler that way or something. I don't know. There's ways maybe. So I think K9 Christian is just fine, and probably the better version of K9 so far. Maybe the best K9 version, but maybe there's also some other experimentation with the K9. I think that is one of the more interesting parts about this ban list, is like which K9 deck is going to come out on top, because the ones that are previously the standard, Christian and Vanquish Soul, have been pretty heavily neutered. All right. Sky Striker is a deck that I personally like a lot. Shocker, I know. And I think it has top tier potential. Top tier potential is kind of like a category that I use between tier 1 and tier 2, because that's where I put decks that I think are really good, but I might be wrong depending on how the format plays out, and they might end up being just more like a solid tier 2 option. I think Sky Striker has the potential to really be something in this format. I think boards without Paradise Smasher are much easier to be broken. As a reference, for example, this deck was able to make top 4 at the World Championships, where Paradise Smasher was banned. And so I think Sky Striker definitely has what it takes to beat decks like Yummy and so on and so forth with board breakers. One thing that's a little bit of a problem for it, however, is Droll and Lockbird. Droll and Lockbird is a big problem for Sky Striker. We've talked about it in the past, and I think it depends a little bit on how popular that card is going to be. And I think it's not going to be a main deck card, so that's good news, but I think a lot of people are still going to be siding it, and that might be rough. So we'll see about that. But it's definitely a deck with top tier potential, especially with Doom of Dimensions. We've just looked at an OCG metagame report. People are actually playing the Radiant Typhoon Side Trance in this deck, which is basically a draw 2 cards and then discard a quick play spell from your hand, which fills your graveyard with spells really easily in Sky Striker. And I think that engine is pretty interesting. So that might even help it play through Droll a little bit, because it's a quick play, so you can activate it in draw phase. Pretty cool deck. I think I'm going to try it for sure, and it has some solid potential. White Forest. White Forest, I think, is a very solid combo deck. I think I'm gonna put it in tier 2. I don't think it is going to be exceptionally good, because it's just, I personally think it struggles a little bit going second, but depending on what decks are on top, like Yummy, for example, I think the deck can probably be built in a way where it's good against Yummy going second by playing some board breakers. It is a strong deck. It's a strong combo deck. It's very scary when it gets to go first. You can also play around board breakers pretty well, because that's something that, you know, people have been discussing. You know, should I play board breakers? Should I play hand traps now? I guess we'll wait and see. There's always going to be people preferring hand traps, but some people are messing around with board breakers now because Paradise Smasher is gone, and those you can definitely catch off guard if you play White Forest, because that deck makes some pretty disgusting boards that are very hard to break. But similar to Sky Striker, it suffers from Droll, and I think it's just a little bit weaker going second, so I'm throwing it in tier 2. Branded, even with a second Branded fusion, I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't love Branded. I think Branded can be mixed with Draco Tail, but I consider that more of a Draco Tail deck than a Branded deck, so I'm gonna bring that up later. I think Branded is fine. I personally don't see a reason to play it if you're just trying to win, but if you really like the deck, then I think you can. It's not bad, I don't think. I think it hovers somewhere between tier 2 and tier 3. I wouldn't really recommend playing Branded, but I also don't think it's bad. Draco Tail. Draco Tail, personally, I'm a believer. I'm a Draco Tail believer. I think this deck is very strong now. I think it loses some of its weaker matchups, whereas like now a lot of its better matchups are left over. Like Yummy, for example, is a pretty good matchup for Draco Tail, as well as the Herald of the Arclight going to 1 is actually a bigger deal than you might think for Draco Tail, because something that ended up happening very often. Of course, Draco Tail has to out Herald of Arclight, otherwise you have a problem. And so people are focusing a lot of effort into outing one Herald, and then Yummy just makes the second one in main phase 2, and then you can no longer out it because your battle phase has been used, and it's really hard for Draco Tail to then play. That's no longer the case. Herald of Arclight is now at 1, so if you just out one Herald, you are free to play, and your matchup is actually really good into Yummy if you do that. The thing is, which is why I also think you should take this with a grain of salt, is I think there are really good cards out there against Draco Tail. You know, I'm looking at cards cards like Retaliating C, in some cases also Contact C, D-Barrier, and the ceiling of the deck is not the highest. It needs to be played properly, and it needs to, like, it usually goes into grind games. You know, Luna Light is potentially good against it because it can make the towers, and Draco Tail kind of has to respect that now. Decks like Gem Knight can go second and maybe overpower it because its ceiling isn't the highest. So I think Draco Tail is a top tier deck, but not in the way that we're like it's the best by far. I think it's gonna have its counter plays, it's gonna have good cards against it, people are gonna focus on it more now, but overall I still think it's a really good deck and I like it a lot. Fiendsmith. Fiendsmith, I'm very happy, but now basically we actually just talk about the Fiendsmith deck because Moon is finally gone. So a lot of these other combo slop tiles will no longer just make Fiendsmith inside their combo. So when I'm saying Fiendsmith, I actually mean Fiendsmith, the Fiendsmith control deck, basically, right? Which personally, I think is not very well positioned, unfortunately. I think the Fiendsmith engine in decks that can still use it, like Evil Twins, for example, that have very easy Fiendsmith access, you're obviously going to play Fiendsmith and that's going to be good, but the actual Fiendsmith deck is not that well positioned. It doesn't make broken boards, so like decks like Sky Striker or whatever can probably just overpower it. Caesar is not that good against Yummy, but it is good against Draco Tail. So Draco Tail, when you go first, is probably a good matchup for Fiendsmith control, but in general, also hand traps are not that efficient against decks like Yummy and also against Draco Tail. Like, I mean, Ash is good, but if they resolve a Rahu Draco Tail, what are you going to do with like Baylor, Ogre, those kind of cards? So I think Fiendsmith just doesn't grind well enough against decks like Draco Tail and Yummy, and so I don't consider it a super good pick for the current format. Gem Knight is a deck that I definitely know has top tier potential. I personally think that depends on a lot of things where like I just don't have enough experience with the deck myself yet to really tell you, yes, it's definitely tier 1 or nah, it's more like tier 2. I think Gem Knight is a strong deck. I definitely think people should respect it moving forward because it can break some disgusting boards. And I talked to some people who played Gem Knights before and they said like, oh, one of the biggest problems was Paradise Smasher because you do just send people first and then you basically try to tenpai them, and that's no longer gonna be a problem, you know. Smasher is gone, so you can actually just friggin' play this deck, go second and OTK people very consistently, and then you play Protoss, and if they send you first after siding, you just Protoss them and you can basically reach every attribute. So I think it's a scary concept. I think it could definitely be something to look at, and I think I would advise everyone to look into this deck and also practice against it, because that's one of the differences to tenpai. It is a very powerful going second deck, so in some games it's going to feel like you can't really do much if they just have all the right breakers and combo pieces, but in a lot of games it's a lot more interactable than tenpai because they don't have like the cards that say like everything's unaffected or can't activate anything during the battle phase. So in the instance where let's say they don't have the perfect board breaker for your board and they just play into it, you will have choke points, you will have ways to interact with the deck, and for those games it's going to be very important to understand how this deck works, and this is something that I also have to do myself, but I'm pretty sure it's a strong pick for the upcoming format, especially considering how the decks up here like Draco Tail and Yummy don't make the craziest boards, so going second against them is not going to be the hardest task ever. So yeah, Ryziel variations. I think Ryziel variations across the board. Pure Ryziel probably not powerful enough right now, especially if people play more board breakers. I think Heraldic and Onomat Ryziel are still like reasonable decks to play. I don't hate them, you know, like if they go first they still go pretty hard. I think losing 1x Ryziel hurts, but those decks tend to play like 7 or 8 copies of it anyways because you've got Bonfire, 7th Ascension, 7th Tachyon, so they're probably going to be fine in that regard. Droll and Lockbird not being as present in the main decks is definitely good for these like over the top combo decks, and Protoss still existing gives decks like Heraldic Ryziel like a realistic win con going second as well. So but I think in general like those decks are still fine. I don't particularly love them, but I also don't think they're bad. K9. Here I want to mention two things. Pure K9, like pure K9, I think is a tier 3 deck. I think the pure K9 deck just doesn't really function super well. It doesn't have the consistency needed. Like if you think about it, a pure K9 deck in terms of starters, 3 Noroi, 3 Case for K9, 3 Jockle, and 3 Chaotic Elements, but Jockle and Chaotic Elements don't even always work because they are 2-card combos. 12 starters does not make for a good pure K9 deck. On top of that, the pure pure K9 endboard isn't even that good. The main quality of K9 was always to be paired with another deck, and then it was good. I think then we're talking between K9 Crystron and K9 Vanquisol being hit quite significantly. I think it remains to be seen what the best K9 deck now is. If someone manages to find a good K9 hybrid version, we're talking top tier potential, genuinely. I think if someone figures it out, like what is the best K9 version now, and actually builds it well for the format, I think we're talking a very good deck. Until then, a pure K9 goes into tier 3. Let it be known that K9 variants, I think, have top tier potential. There is a realistic chance that someone finds something that ends up surprising everybody. And yeah. Luna Light. Luna Light is hard for me to evaluate because the deck, it's like a paradox. I think the deck has top tier potential. Like I mentioned earlier, Paradise Smasher is gone, and Board Breaker Luna Light was a really good strategy also at the World Championships. It got second place. It's just a very good concept in a format where decks don't make that crazy of an end board to just go like play Fuba and a bunch of Board Breakers and try to summon Liger Dancer. The problem with Luna Light is as soon as people know what's going on and respect it more, it becomes worse. And I do see a lot of people now gravitating towards playing answers to it. Like people are considering playing kaijus, lava golems, or sphere modes if their decks can facilitate it, or other ways to out it. Like people are getting creative in all sorts of different ways to try and find a Luna Light Liger Dancer out for their deck that actually works. Pair that with some decks that sometimes are played with a lot of hand traps, like Draco Tail and Yummy can play a significant amount of hand traps, so you might not even get to combo. So I think Luna Light is hard to evaluate, but I do think it is a deck that definitely has top tier potential. I think all of the stars actually align for Luna Light right now. A lot of the things are looking good for it, but the problem is everyone knows that, and if people prepare too much for it, then it might be tough. I think top tier potential is fair. Malice. Besides the fact that you should never play Malice, I think Malice is still a tier 2 deck. I think I would rate it slightly lower than the combo Ryziel variation, simply because I feel like it's slightly less consistent. And I don't know. I mean, one Dormouse and Splash Mage. The Splash Mage I feel like is a relatively big deal because it just means that it's way more efficient to hand trap the deck now. And some of the combos are also going to be worse because every single Malice combo went through Splash Mage at some point just to make your end board stronger as well. I do think getting rid of Splash Mage was an amazing decision because it makes the deck so much easier to actually interrupt. I think that's something that they are really gonna notice with Malice, is that there's gonna be games where you don't play through that like Veiler Imperm combo anymore, or that Ash Imperm combo anymore, because you just don't have that easy Splash Mage in the middle, or you can't recover from the Nibiru so easily because you just make like Link Spider after and then Splash Mage with it, and so on and so forth, right? I think there's probably going to be ways for it. You're going to see some experimentation with like extra extenders like Sky Striker cards and whatever, but I think what's left is probably like a tier 2 deck. The good news is people might play less Lancia now because Malice is not that popular, but at the same time, people might still consider Lancia for decks like Crystron and Lunalight, depending on how powerful those end up being. If that's the case, maybe Malice is now the deck that's being caught in the crossfire. If people actually, like, I could see a world where people play Lancia for Lunalight and then just like it happens to be good against Malice, which is funny because it used to be the other way around, but that's just how things go sometimes, you know? Memento. Memento is a deck that I'm personally a big fan of. I think the deck is just fine. I don't have much to say about it. I think it's one of the decks that potentially has K9 synergy. K9 Memento could be a thing. Yeah, I like it. I think it's still a pretty solid deck. I think it's nice because it kind of like does a little bit of both. The deck is fine into high impact hand traps like the Charmies and Droll, which are definitely going to be played. It has the ability to push through low impact hand traps like Veiler, Imperm, Ash. Not every hand, but like, you know, a decent amount of hands will play through those. And it also has a way to play against board breakers. You know, it doesn't lose to a single Dark Ruler evenly droplet. It's pretty resilient to a lot of things, and I like that about it. So I think Memento is still going to be a fine pick moving forward. Necros. Necros is the first deck I'm going to throw into tier 4. As much as my heart is bleeding right now, and I'm probably still going to bring it to locals once, I just haven't really seen a concept with the new Necros cards that feels like it actually does enough and is actually good, you know? I don't know. It's just not it, I feel. Especially, it just gets in the crossfire for so many things. Like, if people still side deck Droll and everything, it's gonna be a problem. One Herald of the Arclight, funnily enough, also hurts it sometimes because you can only do the Kaleidoscope into Unicorn once now, and after it gets significantly worse later. That's kind of annoying. I think it used to play 2 heralds. Orchist loses a couple of hybrid variations, you know, like you can no longer as easily play stuff like Orchist Fiendsmith or Orchist Mitsurugi because you're losing a couple of bridges in Feral Imp and Moon of the Closed Heaven. I think Orchist itself still operates relatively well in the environment that we're looking at. I think Orchist both makes solid boards, has solid grind game, and has the ability to go second if built properly. Hypothetically, you can still play Orchist with Fiendsmith, or you can still play Orchist with Mitsurugi. You just don't have the bridge anymore. But if you draw, but they still interact well with each other. You just don't bridge into the other engine. So it can still be used to increase the ceiling and the consistency of the deck a little bit. Maybe even K9, sure, maybe. I like Orchist. I still have to try it. I will say, when I tried pure Orchist a while ago, I thought it was not quite consistent enough. A secondary engine would be nice. Pure Orchist is probably going to be slightly too inconsistent, but I still think it's a deck with solid tier 2 potential. I don't think it's going to break into like the top, like best deck of the format, but I think it's fine. Less Lancea is also going to be cool for it. Snake Eyes. I included Snake Eyes because Poplar and Ash went back to 3, but without original, you just can't really do that much with those other than just do the Snake Eye combo, and Poplar in itself is also not going to be a good draw anymore because Poplar into the field spell doesn't really do anything. I don't really see a way to play Snake Eye. I've seen people play Snake Eye with Yummy, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, honestly, because I feel like that's just adding more normal summons to the Yummy deck, which I don't think the Yummy deck needs. Maybe I'm missing something there. I mean, you do probably increase the ceiling of Yummy that way. I don't know if Yummy needs that. I don't know if Yummy wants to play more bricks necessarily instead of non-engine. As far as pure Snake Eyes goes, I don't really see it. Mermail, I think, goes right into tier 2. I think it's the perfect candidate for like smackdown middle tier 2. Pretty strong when it goes first still. Not the greatest deck into Charmies, not the greatest deck into Droll. That is still very valid to play. Very similar to stuff like White Forest and Ryzeal Onomat or Ryzeal Heraldic. Like pretty hit or miss decks that are not my style. So I don't personally love these decks, but I do see why some people like them, and I see that they are really scary to play against when they're going first. Punk is, in my opinion, a tier 3 strategy. I'm not a huge fan of the Punk deck. I think it is just a weaker version of other mid-rangey combo decks. I think it just doesn't really have much going for it. Now it also loses the bridge to Fiendsmith, like Punk Fiendsmith. That was a pretty solid deck. Maybe there's a world where you can play Punk with K9 because it does have a level 5 monster in the deck that you can access easily. So you can make things like your Jockle live early if you only draw 1 access to it, right? You can search level 5 and then special that and so on. Like, not a huge fan of it. I think it doesn't play into boards very well with the cards. I mean, you do have an extender now. That's only 1 card in your deck, and if you don't manage to like resolve a Zeamin, you are not guaranteed to have it in your hand, and that's going to be rough. Mitsurugi. Mitsurugi is a top tier deck now. Of course, when I say Mitsurugi, we are now limited to basically pure Mitsurugi. I think pure Mitsurugi is going to be the way to go. It's still, I mean, you can still play Mitsurugi engines in other decks that don't rely on bridging into it. I mean, in the past, we've seen people play Mitsurugi in decks like Malice just because drawing Habakiri is insane, or draw prayers and that card searches Habakiri and that card is crazy. And I think that's a viable strategy still, alongside just pure Mitsurugi being a very good deck, right? Like I really like Mitsurugi. I also think Mitsurugi has an exceptionally good matchup against Yummy. I played against Mitsurugi a bunch at my regional yesterday. I played Yummy, and let me tell you, that matchup is rough. It grinds very well. I think Mitsurugi, I think the, this is specifically why I'm attesting some potential to these decks down here. Lunalight, Sky Striker, and Gem Knight, I think, have a pretty good time dealing with these 3 decks up here. And I think this is an interesting dynamic to me that is hard to figure out and hard to evaluate for now. Decks like Sky Striker and Gem Knight could have a pretty easy time going second into decks like Draco Tail, Pure Mitsurugi, and Yummy, because their decks are all relatively breakable, and that's why I think those decks have high potential right now. But then maybe if you think this this development through, if people play these decks up here, maybe there is an argument to be made to play decks that are more focused on going first, like K9 Crystron, like Mermail, like White Forest, like Heraldic Ryzeal, to exploit the fact that people are playing decks like Gem Knight or Sky Striker, and lower ceiling decks like Draco Tail and Mitsurugi and Yummy that you maybe can overrun when you're going second. Like there's a world where people started playing really high ceiling decks, and then decks like Striker and Gem Knight aren't it anymore, and decks like Draco Tail and Mitsu also get overrun. But yeah. Archmage, for now, chills in tier 3. Archmage, also one of the few decks that can still really easily access Fiendsmith because they have a spell card that turns a monster into I think any type and attribute that you want. So you can make anything a light fiend. So anything can be Moon. So I think like stuff like Fiendsmith Archmage or K9 Archmage could be experimented with, and maybe it's better than I'm giving it credit for, simply because I haven't played those specific versions. It's more like a guess of where it would be, but I haven't played it as much. But maybe, you know, now that I'm saying it, maybe something like K9 Archmage or Fiendsmith Archmage could be a little better than that. Yeah. All right, and now I'm gonna give you guys some first impressions to some Doom of Dimension archetypes. Of course, I've taken into consideration the new cards for Draco Tail and Yummy and K9 for evaluating these decks already, but now for some decks that are basically completely new in the format because of Doom of Dimension. DDD, I think, will align itself pretty much smack down in the middle of tier 2. I think this deck is scary. I think this deck is good, but it is basically exactly the same thing as decks like Heraldic Ryzeal, White Forest, and Mermail, like a pretty all-out combo deck that I don't think has anything quote-unquote special going on for it. You know, it's going to be relatively weak into Charmies. It's going to be, I think, relatively weak going second from what I've seen so far. It's a viable combo deck, but I don't think it's exceptionally strong. Like, it's not like exceptionally good into hand traps or exceptionally good going second or exceptionally consistent. It's just like, it's just there. But it's also not like my style, so I haven't invested hours into it and can tell you all the nuances, what makes it better or worse than White Forest or Mermail or Heraldic Rising or whatever. You know, like, yeah. I think it's just fine. The new Rose Dragons, from what I've seen, are pretty underwhelming. Nothing crazy to be said about these cards right now. They read pretty cool, but it just seems like they're not doing anything super well. In general, Doom of Dimension, some of the archetypes, I think it's good legacy support, or like, I mean, Draco Tail and Yummy is not like legacy. It's a good DLC, basically, but like some of the new decks are not that convincing. Doomsy, I will say, Doomsy, I have not seen anything with the deck yet, like any experimentation, so it's very hard for me to evaluate. My guess is that it's weaker than Archmage. I personally think the cards read weaker than Archmage cards, so I'll throw it like here. That's just a guess though, I haven't tried it. RB, yeah. Tri-Brigade. Tri-Brigade, I think, is interesting. Pure Tri-Brigade is probably going to be a little bit underwhelming in terms of power level. Although, as you can see from the decks I'm putting in tier 1, I think there is room for decks that are more mid-rangey. You know, decks like Draco Tail, Mitsu, Yummy, Orchist. I think mid-range is going to be solid at the start of the format. I don't hate the idea of playing a mid-rangey Tri-Brigade deck. I think Tri-Brigade still, like, doesn't push super well into boards. I think the reality is you're probably going to want to find some hybrid version of Tri-Brigade, which I think is something that in the OCG they haven't really bothered trying, because all of those like Lyrilusk or whatever are going to be pretty bad into like Max C, which for us, I think the deck is better than it's performing in the OCG right now, simply because I think our environment is going to be better for Tri-Brigade than the OCG environment. Like in general, we are in like a lower power format where something more low to the ground like Tri-Brigade can work, and we also have more ways to experiment with like other engines because we're not as constricted by stuff like Max C. So I think there's some potential here. I'm gonna throw it in tier 2. I like the new cards. I think it's worth messing around with. Not quite convinced enough by it to throw it up here, simply because I don't feel confident in making that statement, and I haven't played with it enough, but I think it's looking solid. But this is also, it's a little biased because I like that deck. It's more my style, right? It's something that I would really vibe with. So it's kind of like I'm looking at it through the lens of it's a concept that I like. So I'm more inclined to think that it can work. Radiant Typhoon, similar kind of. I think we've talked about it already, and we've just looked at Sky Striker using those cards as an engine. I think as an engine, this deck has a lot of potential to be played. I don't know if the pure Radiant Typhoon deck even is a thing right now. I don't think it is. Like maybe as a pure deck, more like here. More like a tier 3 strategy. As an engine, I think it's pretty good. It's kind of like K9 basically. I think the pure deck is going to be underwhelming for now, but I think if someone finds a good pairing for either K9 engine or Radiant Typhoon engine, I could genuinely see these decks pop up in like top tier decks. It's just the pure deck itself for now. My first impression is that it's not going to be that good, but it also just feels like a deck that's more like meant meant to be paired with something else, is how I feel about it. But yeah. Anyways, once again, a reminder, this is just a first impression. I haven't played the new format yet. Doom of Dimension is coming out soon. It is still very much up in the air. Do take this with a grain of salt. I just wanted to give you guys my first impression. Please let me know what you think. Am I wrong with my assumption that like the best decks in the format are going to be decks that are going to be lower to the ground, like Draco Tail Mitsuyami? Do you think there is like combo potential out there that's going to be far better? Please let me know. I'm very interested in what everyone thinks, and I'm very excited for this new format and YCS Lil coming up soon and everything. So I hope you enjoyed this little bit of a discussion. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That would mean a lot to me. And yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.